Speaker tonight is Bob Gillespie, who is the site manager for the Prairie Ridge State Natural Area, which is the only location in the state that currently supports a population of Greater Prairie Chickens. Bob was, I met Bob, or at least I met Bob over email several years ago when I discovered Prairie Ridge State Natural Area. Reached out to him to ask about prairie chickens. When's the best time to go? When's the best time to see them? And he was very kind, very patient, and answered all my questions way back when. So when I took over this role, Bob was near the top of the list for people I wanted to speak to the group. Bob is a native of southeastern Illinois and has worked with prairie chickens and grasslands since he learned to tie his shoes. As the site manager, much work is conducted to promote declining grassland species, and intensive habitat management is required to maintain varied natural communities and species of conservation concern in the area. Bob is a grassland ecologist and believes in aggressive management of natural lands. Tonight's meeting, titled Foot Stamping and Booming, Our Illinois Prairie Chickens, will focus on the current status of Greater Prairie Chickens in Illinois. Prairie chickens have a long history in the state and have been the subject of conservation efforts since the late 1950s. We will learn about the life history of prairie chickens, the historical reasons why they are still present in our state, and what the future prospects are for this bird. Prairie Ridge State Natural Area is the focus of prairie chicken recovery efforts in Illinois and is a core grassland area dedicated to the protection and recovery of many imperiled grassland species. Bob will further discuss some of the other grassland species that call Prairie Ridge home and the work needed to keep these animals flourishing. So again, hold questions to the end. We are going to have some question and answer time at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Bob.
Thank you so much for all the attendees tonight. It's a great honor to be able to present to everyone about Greater Prairie Chickens. And it's unfortunate I couldn't be up to visit with the group in person, but we'll go through my PowerPoint about Greater Prairie Chickens and have a dialogue this evening about this wonderful organism. So I'm Bob Gillespie. I'm an employee of the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, and I work with the Illinois Department of Natural Resources and also the Illinois Audubon Society. So like Robert alluded to, the title of my talk is Foot Stamping and Booming. So if you know anything about Greater Prairie Chickens, they are an unbelievable organism that has a fantastic, charismatic spring courtship display, which at this time of the year is kind of coming to a close. But we had a good booming season this year, and they did very well. I like to say the boys put on a great program. So we'll transition to my PowerPoint. And again, it's my great pleasure to present to the DuPage Birding Club. Okay, so Greater Prairie Chickens are an iconic grassland bird of Illinois, and they're a great symbol of rarity in the state now, and unfortunately, somewhat of a symbol of great loss, just simply for the thousands of acres of native grassland that we lost through the years, and the plight of grassland wildlife in general. Greater prairie chickens are a species of grouse, and they have an elaborate reproductive strategy, and they have a lot of characteristics that are very chicken-like. They are therefore, unfortunately, named chickens because the pioneers, when they saw them on the prairie, when they were settling North America and Illinois, they thought, well, that just looks like a chicken. And they do in one way or another. So Prairie Ridge is situated in downstate Illinois, south of 70, Interstate 70, near Effingham. And it's located on the gray prairies in Illinois. So when I mean gray prairies, I mean our soils are not as dark as central Illinois, but we're part of the prairie landscape as the prairies kind of transition to more of the Shawnee Hills. But we have two locations in Illinois that are under the jurisdiction of Prairie Ridge. One of them is the Jasper County unit, and the other is the Marion County unit. Both of those have greater prairie chickens. Prairie Ridge is a sizable grassland preserve. We are approaching, this is an older slide of tract acreages, but we are approaching 4,500 acres, more or less. So fairly sizable as grassland areas go, and it's a core grassland here in the state of Illinois. Now, the unique thing about Prairie Ridge is it's not just your typical state park. It is a site that is reserved for endangered species, and therefore access to the site is not as facile as other state parks, basically to protect the endangered species. But the management on the site is very intensive, and the landscape or preserve design is patchy in distribution. And it makes a little bit of sense because greater prairie chickens are very flighted, and lots of grassland birds, of course, are, and they can move from unit to unit. And we have found that a patchwork type of landscape design is suitable for greater prairie chickens and other grassland wildlife. Contiguous nature is not always necessary. Prairie Ridge has been a site for much study of grassland management and biodiversity management in general. The Illinois Natural History Survey and the Nature Conservancy were here at the very outset of the development of Prairie Ridge. And some of the first procurement of lands for the protection of greater prairie chickens occurred here on the Jasper County unit. One of the first units was purchased 1959 to 1960. And that property was bought by the Illinois Prairie Chicken Society, which I think is really lovely. Even at that time, we knew that prairie chickens needed protection and they needed grassland. Prairie Ridge developed from there as an area where the Illinois Natural History Survey did a very, very intensive nest survey project where they assessed nesting prairie chickens and pheasants and other grassland wildlife, and did lots of nest searching across the landscape to discover what areas grassland wildlife nested in, where the prairie chickens nested, what habitats they used, and therefore we know a tremendous amount about greater prairie chickens and what they need when it comes to good nesting and reproductive cover. Now, the peak abundance of greater prairie chickens in Illinois was 10 to 14 million birds in 1850 to 1860. And that, it just absolutely boggles my mind. What a wonder that would be if we still had that many animals. Today, we have likely less than 150 greater prairie chickens in our state, which is a tragedy, but it is what it is. And endangered species are very difficult to manage and preserve and take tremendous effort. Now, if you look at the distribution of greater prairie chickens in the United States, it is very broadly distributed. Greater prairie chickens occupied areas that spanned from Texas all the way into Canada. In fact, the range actually goes off of this map into Canada. So this organism is very, very hardy and can withstand some tremendous climatic variations. Today, if you look at this map, you will see the current distribution, the greater dark blue colored areas. And if you look at it closely, there are populations in Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, some smaller populations in Missouri, and of course, our small isolated population still here in Illinois. And what I always like to tell folks is that those little satellite areas are very important when it comes to the conservation of this organism, because sometimes those isolated populations are important vestiges of genetic information. We never lost all the greater prairie chickens in Illinois, and we still have our Illinois genetic signature running within our flock. And that's important. It's also important to maintain a population, because if times change, we can reintroduce greater prairie chickens to an existing population. Once populations of greater prairie chickens go extinct, it is very, very difficult to bring them back, because greater prairie chickens are a very gregarious bird. And if they don't find their buddies, they're going to go looking for them. And what that means, if it's unoccupied habitat, it's very, very probably impossible to get a population established. The state of Illinois has been involved with the preservation of greater prairie chickens here since 1940. So we knew even back then that prairie chickens were pretty cool and that they were declining, and we needed to do some conservation measures. Now, one thing I always like to talk about is biologists have worked with greater prairie chickens for years. And what is really interesting to me is if you look back at the historical record, especially if you look in Indiana or northern part of Illinois, you can go back to the historical information of booming grounds that were surveyed way back then in the 1940s. And you know what you will find? You will find Aldo Leopold's name, and he did the same thing that I do even today. He went out and he counted greater prairie chickens on their booming ground, and he wrote them down. And he wrote, A. Leopold observed X number of prairie chickens this day in April in 1940. And I think that's really cool that a preeminent ecologist back in the day did work with greater prairie chickens just like we're doing today. Now, the population trends in Illinois are in a downward slide. I'm not going to lie. But the population is small, and climatic situations are a little bit different than they were historically. So one thing we have noticed is that after some of our translocation work, we see a bolster of numbers, and then over time, we will see somewhat of a decline. So we have a plateau after translocation work, and then a slow trajectory of decline. And that's a factor of our population being so isolated, and the fact that we don't have individuals coming and going from our population. Now, translocations are a significant and drastic conservation measure. And we conducted translocations several different times in the past, in fact. And the most recent ones were conducted in 2014, 2016, and 2017. And at different times, we released birds in Marion County or the Jasper County flock, or we split between the two. But each time we saw population increases, and we saw our genetic signature within our flock being very healthy afterwards. And it's still healthy today. Declines are notable, and they're being driven by our wetter conditions during our nesting situation. The nest initiation and incubation and hatching is a critical time for Greater Prairie chickens. And it's a time when the animals are very fragile. Young birds and birds in the nest or in the egg are very fragile to flooding or a stochastic weather event of some type. They're very fragile in the early part of their life history, which is like most organisms, that is the case. Now, let's talk about broods and nesting. It's one of my favorite things. Prairie chicken hens are ground nesters, and they're very selective about where they'll nest, and they're very secretive. And they will only utilize grasslands that have good nest material, that has a little overhead screening, so maybe like a goldenrod stem or a dewberry vine, something that gives them a little screening from overhead predators. And those nesting sites are usually located close to booming grounds. Hens prefer to nest closer to where they breed and on those booming grounds. Prairie chicken chicks are precocial. What that means, when mama decides everybody's out of the egg and everybody's dried and warmed up and she decides to leave the nest, all the babies go. I kind of like to think of it like airborne troopers out of the back of an aircraft. They are go, 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 just as quickly as they can away from that nest. So they're precocial. They are ready to go. The difference, the opposing situation of that is an organism that's altricial, like baby robins. They're helpless in the nest for a long time. Greater Prairie chickens, once they come out of the egg and dry off, they are ready to rock. So, and the neat thing about Greater Prairie chicken chicks is that they are considered independent of their mother by 6 weeks of age. So they grow very quickly, and they are flighted by 6 weeks of age, and they get more and more durable as an individual as they age in those 6 weeks. Now, for Greater Prairie chickens and bobwhite quail and other grassland birds, brood habitat, where the hen chickens take their nestlings, or where the mama bobwhite quail takes her chicks, is one of the most important cover types that I actually manage, and we create a lot of it. And I would venture that it is a limiting factor somewhat for recruitment of grassland wildlife. And brood cover is basically what you see here. It's a little bit weedy. It has lots of clovers and alfalfa and just a tremendous biomass of insects. This is one example of what a brood strip might look like. Sometimes they're more weedy, but usually, hey, they have a little overhead screening, and they're fairly easy for mama and her brood to move through. Brood habitat should be located in close proximity to nesting cover and close to the booming ground. So when mama hatches her brood, she can take her chicks immediately to good cover for her nestlings, all right? And hens will occupy brood cover if they're happy there for a long time. In fact, I had one radio tracked hen that she hatched at her nest site, and she walked her chicks up a road about probably 250 yards And she occupied an alfalfa patch on Prairie Ridge the whole summer. And that alfalfa patch was only 4 acres. But she raised her babies in that. And I was most proud of her because she raised 8 chicks to maturity within that good quality brood cover, which is exciting to me. So they have great fidelity to a site that where their babies do well. Brood cover should be about 20 to 30% open ground. The open ground is very important. You don't want it to be too dense because you want the young to be able to move easily and to escape from different predators and to basically have overhead screening to combat avian predators, which can be a significant problem. One thing that I have to do a lot of is meadow conversion. So prairies and grasslands in general are very dynamic landscapes. And at times you have infestations of exotic plant species, or the meadow gets too dense, or it gets unattractive, or it gets too many woody species in it, and you have to change it. You have to use conversion methods, whether that's disking, or sometimes it requires a herbicide application. An example is tall fescue. It can be a great problem in our prairies, and if allowed to go unmanaged, it creates a monoculture grassland that is not good quality for grassland wildlife. So we're going to transition to another little topic. Let's talk about greater prairie chickens as an umbrella species. So when I talk about greater prairie chickens as an umbrella species, greater prairie chickens require large home ranges and require a vast variety of grassland habitats throughout the year. Their life history requires brood cover, it requires nesting cover, it requires very, very short cover for their breeding and their booming grounds. And then they also need some cover where they can escape and overwinter that's a little more dense. So for these reasons, greater prairie chickens require a vast diversity of grassland types. And if I can provide all those different habitats, all those different varied grasslands, I can provide for lots of other unique grassland wildlife, which I think is really cool, because that's one of the main thrusts here at Prairie Ridge, is that we have greater prairie chickens, but we have some absolutely awesome other organisms too. And some of you know these very well. Conservation that sustains greater prairie chickens also supports the needs of other numerous species. And if you look at this slide, you'll see a short-eared owl, which during the winter months, we have many short ears on the area. And it's fun for photographers and birders to come through the area and basically take photographs of the short ears from the roadsides. And it's fantastic, and they are so charismatic. We actually have short ears still on the area, and I think we have several that are considering nesting this time, which is awesome. We also have northern harriers, and we have the same thing. We have a few northern harriers that have stuck around. So they're nesting somewhere. I just haven't located those nests yet. And that's okay, because for me to be out in that habitat, sometimes that's more disturbance that's necessary. And we really need our birds to do their thing, don't we? Also, if you look at this slide, you may see a rail. And on Prairie Ridge, we have a lot of different wetland habitats also. And a lot of our prairies are very mesic or wet prairies in some cases. And we have some semi-permanent wetlands that we manage for water birds of various types. And this is a king rail, in fact. And we have several different rail species. We have king rails and black rails and yellow rails. Of course, we have soras, et cetera, et cetera. We have least bitterns and American bitterns. It's awesome. Wonderful things. Here's one that's my favorite. And right now, we're doing surveys for barn owls at Prairie Ridge. And this, I'm not going to lie, has been an absolutely fantastic year for barn owls. If I have a barn owl box up, I have barn owls in them. And that's wonderful, because years ago, that wasn't the case. In Marion County, I think we probably have 15 different barn owl boxes, and all of them are full of mamas on eggs, or we have nestlings of little bitty fuzzy fellers that are getting bigger and bigger every day, or we have day nesting adults. It is a very busy scene for barn owls right now. And in Jasper County, we have the same thing. We have barn owls all over the place. So I'm excited about that. And I think you guys are too. So at Prairie Ridge, we have all 10 area-sensitive grassland bird species found in Illinois. They've all been documented on the site here, and many of them are nesting here. Here's a fun little story that I like to tell my folks. Prairie Ridge is also a really good migratory stopover. And if you look at this slide closely, you're like, now wait a minute. Those look like whooping cranes. And in fact, they are. And if you look closely, you may see 5 individuals. Now, if you look, there's one individual in the center that looks a little buffy, not quite as wide or as large or the other ones. And that is a juvenile whooping crane that was moving through the area. Now, here's the story. These animals were observed when we were radio tracking Greater Prairie Chickens, and we had some radio track birds, and we were tracking those animals. And one day, Mary Emanuel, one of my radio technicians, was out on the area, and Mary was one of those ladies that worked for the Crane Foundation and would put on the crane costume with the beak on her hand and would feed the juvenile cranes. And Mary knew about cranes, and she knew that every single one of these cranes were either well known to science, had a radio tracking device on them, or had a GPS device on them. And she said, well, Bob, let's call the Crane Foundation and see who these birds are. So we did. We called the Crane Foundation. They gave us the different frequencies that would be relevant for our part of the world. And Mary went running out with her receiver to go out and see who these birds were. She went out. She called me on her cell phone and said, Bob, you won't believe it. And she told me about the birds that were out there. And she said, but the neatest thing is that juvenile is one I raised. That's Latka. And she had named that bird. And that was one that she had raised as a chick in Wisconsin. It just happened to show up and followed her to Prairie Ridge, which I think is a lovely story. Now, we also have some more common species. We have dick thistles, and we've got lots of red-winged blackbirds that are somewhat pestilent right now, and they're a little bit worried about their nests and breeding and their chicks, and they're a bit defensive out in the wetlands as they get. We also have different shorebirds that are coming through right now. This is a black-necked stilt from Marion County. We also have bobwhite quail. Today I was out working on controlling autumn olive in one of our meadows, doing some basil bark treatments with herbicide. And the bobwhite were just calling all around me. Just bobwhite, little covey calls and males trying to interact with the different females that were trying to lay their eggs. And it was busy for bobwhite quail today on the prairie too. We also have some non-avian species that occupy the area, and we'll just touch on them briefly because, this is a birding club, and, hey, they're not birds, so, But if you look, sometimes we have the occasional badger that comes through, or we have prairie cicadas that I typically flush in the latter part of the summer, and they erupt out of the meadow like a B-29 on takeoff. And if you look closely at the very bottom of the slide, you'll see ornate box turtles. We have ornate box turtles that are radio tagged right now. The Illinois Natural History Survey is tracking them all over the prairie and documenting where they hibernate and what habitats they utilize through the summer. Now, we'll go back a little bit. Let's talk about times past. Why are prairie chickens still at Prairie Ridge? Well, historically, in 1940, if you look at this map, Yetter mapped the distribution of prairie chickens in Illinois. And the Great Prairies of Illinois is where the population persisted. Now, we also bought properties near Green River, which is near Nachusa, and Iroquois County, which is near Kankakee Sands, because those were locations where we had remnant populations of greater prairie chickens in 1940. We bought those areas for prairie chickens also. But over time and land use changes, those populations dwindled from those areas quickly. But downstate Illinois, here around Prairie Ridge, is where the prairie chickens persisted the longest. And there's a reason for that. The reason is red top agriculture. Yeah, red top is a Eurasian grass that was grown years ago, 50s, 60s, through the 70s, in abundance in this part of Illinois. In fact, we grew over 90% of the world crop here, and we basically had the market for the United States. So Greater Prairie chickens had wonderful surrogate prairie in the form of red top meadows. And that's why we still have them today right here. Because there are different companies that would buy that seed and they would use it in the textile industry to make a red dye. So if you had a red garment before World War II, they used red top seed to dye that garment. So it's very important. This is a red top meadow. As you can see, it's a very nice grassland landscape. And that grass is about knee height, and which is absolutely perfect for greater prairie chickens. And the neat thing about it is they harvested their red top seed after the greater prairie chickens successfully nested, which is very important because red top agriculture today is nothing like that. So this section of Illinois produced 85% of the total world crop and 95% of the U.S. red top seed crop in 1934. And we had probably 2,000 birds that remained here in southeast Missouri up into 1962. The Schultz Seed Company bought lots of red top from producers in this area. And Ging and Company is another grass seed company, and they operated in the Kinmundy area, Kinmundy-Farine area, and that's where our other greater prairie chicken population is. But I like this banner that they sent out. It says, "Time has altered many things. We no longer sell dry goods, groceries, boots, and notions. And today we process very little grass seed. But time has not changed our interest and pride in Farina. Congratulations, Farina News. We are proud of you." So Ging and Company kind of saw the writing on the wall. They saw that their business and their grass seed enterprise was going away, and that grassland has essentially disappeared from the landscape. Isn't that interesting? So we have a lot of knowledge about greater prairie chickens, and it's guided by lots of different things. We have a long-term greater prairie chicken nest search data set. That was that nest search data from the 1970s and 80s that Ron Westemeyer put together. Ron Westemeyer worked for the Illinois Natural History Survey, and over the years, they discovered over 700 greater prairie chicken nests. Can you imagine? The way they did that is they did nest searching, where they lined up and walked across the meadow and looked for greater prairie chicken hens on nest. You know how they find a greater prairie chicken hen on nest? You look for her eye looking back at you from the grass. It's amazing. The neat thing is greater prairie chicken hens will hold tight to the nest till you are absolutely, and I'm talking absolutely, right on her. All right. So you have to go very methodically and carefully to do that type of research, because those hens do not flush at just anything. So they will be there to the last second. We also do a lot of annual site cover mapping, where I go out and look at the different cover types we have, and we plan and consider what each meadow needs, whether it needs herbicide treatment or brush control, or it needs some tillage or some tree removal, on and on and on. Many things have to be considered. We also have done a lot of translocation work, as you know, and a lot of telemetry research. So we know a lot about where the birds go, where they nest, or what habitats they use, because we've been able to follow them around with a radio, basically. And that has told us tremendous information. We've also done a lot of genetic research. We know a lot about the genetic signature of our birds here in Illinois. And some of the preeminent genetic research that is known to science was conducted here at Prairie Ridge with our very isolated and genetically isolated population. Some tremendous research has gone on here. We know more about genetics in our Illinois flock than most things. We also do annual booming ground census work. We are completing that now. Essentially, it has been completed. And we also do a lot of fall covey counts for bobwhite quail. We also look for pheasants and do pheasant surveys. And over the years, we have documented fewer and fewer pheasants here on the area. And that's a good thing, because pheasants are nest parasites on greater prairie chickens, and their incubation period is shorter than greater prairie chickens. So a greater prairie chicken hen, if a pheasant laid eggs in with her clutch, unfortunately would leave with the pheasant chicks because they emerge quicker. So pheasants do not coexist with greater prairie chickens well. So from 1963 to 1982, Prairie Ridge was that focal place for nest research, and over 745 prairie chicken nests were located and 116 pheasant nests. So we knew a lot about chickens and we knew a lot about pheasants, and at that time we recognized that pheasants were not something we needed on the area. And in the late 70s, early 80s, we did all we could to eliminate that stressor from our greater prairie chickens. Now, we do a lot of management, and Robert alluded to my philosophy when it comes to grassland management. It requires some very aggressive and focused management at times. We rotary mow, I said 1,500 acres on this slide, and that's probably low. We probably mow maybe 2,000, maybe 2,500. And when I talk about rotary mowing, everybody thinks, oh, that's just golf course mowing. That's not a good thing. Well, this is prescribed mowing, because greater prairie chicken hens like a certain depth to their grass. They don't like it too tall. They don't like it too short. They like it just so to nest in. There's a Goldilocks zone, and it's about boot top high, because greater prairie chicken hens, when they move through grasslands, they like to act, I like to refer to it kind of like a submarine effect. They're moving through the grassland, kind of under cover of the grass in general, and then they will poke their head up above the grass, take a look for predators or things that they can be concerned about. And then if everything's good, the head comes back down slowly and carefully, and then they move on with what they're up to. So the grass has to be just a certain height, and they like that duff to be there for nesting. It's unbelievably important that that duff is there for them. We also do a lot of prescription fire. We conduct over 1,500 acres of annual prescribed fire across all different seasons. We burn in the fall, we burn in the late winter, we burn in the summertime. Can you imagine that we do that when 90-degree days, we go out and burn meadows? But we do, and it has beneficial ecological effects. We also graze about 500 acres to give us a very short grass condition, which is good for meadowlarks and upland sandpipers and things that like a shorter grass condition. We do shrub plantings and covey headquarters construction and brood strip development, lots and lots, miles and miles of fire line and placement, etc. So prescribed fire seasonality is a significant consideration on the area, because a lot of times you think about the prescribed fire season as something that happens in the winter or something that happens in the dormant season. And a lot of it does. But if you do that all the time on our grasslands, if you're conducting a dormant season burn or a spring burn, you really, really encourage the grasses. And that creates habitat that is way, way too dense for a lot of our grassland wildlife. And you may have seen that. Some of our prairies are very, very dense. In fact, they're not much better than just cover for white-tailed deer because they're so thick. And that's not serving a suite of wildlife, of grassland wildlife well. Okay, so we have to think about fire seasonality. Another tool in our toolbox is growing season prescribed fires. And a lot of times we will conduct growing season prescribed fires to create a meadow that is newly green and very, very open during the summer period. And that gives Greater Prairie Chicken young chicks and bobwhite quail chicks and other grassland wildlife a place that is very open. It is dry. You know, the summertime is very dewy. They can go there and they can thermal regulate, they can dust in the ash, and they can get out of the wet grass. It's important. It very much is. We also do grazing, and this is a good example of smooth brome that's grazed. And if you look at that, it's very, very short. And when we remove the cattle from that pasture, it stays short. And the next growing season, it's a shorter cover type. And that's very important for a lot of different wildlife. They require some shorter grass communities. Sometimes I have meadows that plain and simple just get away from me. And contemporary grassland sometimes requires some heavy-handed, intensive brush control work. And if you go to Nachusa, you will see some of that there. You will see some of that at Medewan too. A lot of times brush work can be very, very intensive and require some, meadows require and prairies require rescuing and renovation sometimes. So sometimes we graze, sometimes we grind, sometimes we doze out trees, sometimes we burn trees aggressively, because trees and grassland have always there's kind of been an animosity since the beginning of time, honestly. So several important elements to consider that are important for grassland wildlife: the vegetation structure, the height, the density, the patchiness, the component of bare ground for thermoregulation and moisture management and parasite mitigation. Prairie chickens love to find a dusting bowl and make a dusting spot. So do bobwhite quail, and sometimes they'll dust in the same spot. And that's basically to get some louse removal and to get some of the ticks off, and they dust just like chickens do. Isn't that interesting? And another thing to consider is just the biomass of the insects out there in the grassland. Sometimes I am simply managing grassland for grasshoppers, because Greater Prairie Chicken chicks like to gorge themselves on grasshoppers, and mama prairie chickens like to feed them grasshoppers. So it's important. There are also other plant-based foodstuffs that I manage, legumes, seeds, green browse, things like that. And I also manage cover for adverse conditions and for predator avoidance. All right, immediate survival habitat, if you will. In Illinois, grasslands must be very aggressively managed, and I think I've driven that home tonight, to set back succession and to maintain grassland biodiversity and limit grass dominance and density. So grassland wildlife and greater prairie chickens need nest cover, brood cover, foraging, loafing, open space cover, roosting areas, and winter cover, of course. Grasslands must support all the life history requirements of many grassland wildlife, and that's my job here at Prairie Ridge, is to provide for as many unique and wonderful grassland species as I possibly can, try to recover them and encourage them to just flourish on our Illinois landscape. I want to thank you all for your attention tonight. I would encourage you to come down to Prairie Ridge. Come down and see the Greater Prairie Chickens on their booming ground. Come down and see them before tax day. After April 15th, the boys kind of tend to settle down and the hens are on the nest. But before then, they put on a wonderful show that can be observed very readily for anyone here at Prairie Ridge. So I encourage you to do that. Don't be a stranger. Prairie Ridge is a neat place, a wonderful grassland complex. And folks from DuPage are always welcome to come down and visit with me and learn about chickens. And if there's any questions I can address them, it's been my great pleasure. Thank you all.
All right, thank you very much, Bob. Right now, we're gonna do some questions. Sorry about that. So does anybody here in the live audience have a question? Yes.
Before tax day, so what are the optimal dates to do this?
Okay, Robert, what we may have to do is repeat the questions. I think I got that one. The optimum dates to view Greater Prairie Chickens here at Prairie Ridge is the very latter part of March or the first 2 weeks in April. Hen visitation on the booming ground is, it peaks about the 7th or the 10th of April, and that's when the boys are most excitable and putting on just a tremendous display.
All right, any other questions? Yes.
How many eggs do they weigh within collection survival rate? And how do they capture them throughout blood and things like that?
Yeah, so Bob, the question was how many eggs are typically laid in a single brood and how many young usually survive to adulthood? That's the first question then I'll. Sure.
Hens usually lay from 12 to 15 eggs, so it's a pretty good clutch. I usually consider if a hen raises half of her clutch to adulthood, that she has done very well.
Great. And what was the second part of the question? Oh, yes. How do you capture the prairie chickens and draw their blood?
Well, to be honest, it's very Wile E. Coyote. And what I mean by that is we put up a big net out on the booming ground and we call it a drop net. And it works by gravity and tension, basically. And I take my pocket knife and it's got a cut cord and it comes back to the blind and you cut the cord and the net falls. And then you basically go running out of the blind and then you can extract the bird from the net. And then you take it to the lab and you do all those morphometrics that you have to do. So yeah, it's a process and it's it's very exciting. and it takes some skill and a lot of early mornings.
Anybody else here in the audience? Okay, we'll go to some chat questions. So we'll just start at the bottom here. All right, so do the prairie chickens and pheasants fight and try to chase each other out?
They will. In fact, when I first started work here in the 90s, we had a couple rooster pheasants that would occupy the booming ground. And of course, the males would put on a show, or the Greater Prairie Chickens would be going through their courtship routine and, you know, jumping and booming. And basically that ringneck pheasant would be out on the booming ground with the Greater Prairie Chickens, just basically chasing the males around. So he was actually even causing problems on the booming ground proper. So yeah, it's all manner of bad interactions when it comes to ringneck pheasants and Greater Prairie Chickens.
And then how closely related are prairie chickens to domesticated chickens?
It's kind, to be honest, they look very similar in some respects, but it's really apples to oranges. I mean, genetically, they're both avian species, but they're very distantly related, honestly.
Okay. So this question is, if we plant a lot of red top grass, can we expect to find prairie chickens?
I wish it was that simple. Wouldn't that be awesome? To be honest, I plant a lot of red top here at Prairie Ridge. I have lots of red top meadows and smooth brome meadows and native prairie and bluegrass meadows. Just a great diversity. Red top is a great Eurasian grass, and I know it's not native, but it's not. It's one of those domesticated species that are kind of beneficial to man, if you will. It doesn't seem to be problematic in our native settings. So it's a really good surrogate prairie. And to be honest, when you're comparing establishing a red top meadow to a native prairie restoration or reconstruction, a red top meadow is a much cheaper grassland to produce and to put into conservation service quickly.
And I actually don't remember the answer to this question because I probably asked you back in the day. Do we have to register or make reservations to come and visit the birds or see them?
No, that's the great thing. You honestly do not have to do that. That said, we have to establish kind of a communication. So if you're going to come down to Prairie Ridge, it's always a good idea to shoot me an email or call me here at the office because I can give you pointers about how to see them on the area. Now, the way my program works here is that we have what we call our North Barn location. And it's an area that birders can drive into, they can park their vehicle, they can walk behind the office, set up a spotting scope or binoculars, and watch the birds in great comfort. I mean, you're in a yard, it is easy. I'm telling you, it is simple. Your cup of coffee in hand, and your scope, and it's just a good time. And it really works well, and anyone can do it. And what I typically do is I open my gates March 15th and leave them open day and night till about April 16th. So birders can come and go. And if you're driving in from DuPage and you're traveling a long distance, the gates are going to be open. And if you come in about a little bit after dawn, you know, but you want to be before 8 o'clock, you can sneak around behind the office and get great views of prairie chickens. Yes.
Great. How many prairie chickens can the current habitat at Prairie Ridge support, and is it near capacity?
That's a very good question. The habitat here at Prairie Ridge can support more animals, but Greater Prairie chickens require a lot of acreage and a lot of very good quality grassland cover. Great diversity of that. So we are not at capacity for the number of animals we could support, but we have some significant challenges in every grassland in Illinois right now to support grassland avian species to begin with. So grassland wildlife are struggling. So the answer to that is, yeah, I could have more Greater Prairie chickens on the area, but they have to survive. And that's the long and short of it, people, really is.
Do coyotes predate on prairie chickens? And then I guess I was thinking about when you were showing pictures of the owls and harriers, do those birds try to get the young prairie chickens?
No, not necessarily. Harriers and short ears, they're primarily a mouser. You know, they're out there looking for small mammals, and they're not necessarily an avian predator on Greater Prairie chicken young. Now, my answer to coyotes is this: everything likes a chicken dinner. All right. In fact, if I could get Kentucky Fried Chicken after this program, I would. I'm starving. But long and short of it is, if a coyote could catch a chicken, they would. I mean, plain and simple. But that said, usually coyotes are very similar to harriers or short ears in that, you know, they can catch a vole easy. I mean, it's no problem. They can just scoop them up anytime. That's easy. So to catch a chicken is a totally different deal. So I have seen coyotes run through the booming ground and not even giving the males a second look. I've seen them run by the booming ground and they're going and not caring. So coyotes are not the nest predator that people make them out to be. Now, that said, the other part of that question is, we have a lot of different mesopredators. So when I say mesopredators, that's the skunks and possums and raccoons and feral cats and all those suite of species. And they are nest predators. They will take adults. They will take chicks. Those are significant predators. But that's the natural world. And, you know, during fall migration, when the hawks are coming through, some of you have been out on hawk watches before during migration, right? Those are neat programs. We lose adult prairie chickens to hawks that come through the area and are avian predators at that time. In fact, our hens at that time of the year are so exhausted from raising their broods that they fall prey to lots of different species, including those avian predators at that time.
Before I ask the last question, does anybody have any other questions here in the audience? Yes.
I'm just wondering if there's any plans to try to increase, like bring in birds, increase the population more. It looks like it's gonna go down to nothing.
Yeah, is there a plan to bring more prairie chickens in at any time?
Let me answer this real quick here. There is an overarching plan for the recovery of Greater Prairie chickens in Illinois, and it was produced by Jeff Walk. Jeff is with the Nature Conservancy and several other biologists that were instrumental in that plan. And that plan calls for translocations for genetic recovery and demographic recovery if the population drops below 50 animals. So that's always a consideration and is something that we move on if necessary. Yes.
Someone else just asked, do you have Franklin's ground squirrels?
I wish. Wouldn't that be fun? I don't have Franklin's ground squirrels or line ground squirrels this far south, unfortunately.
Okay. And I know you just put your email and phone number in the chat.
Yes.
If somebody wants to, after this, try to get in touch with you, should they just go to the website?
Our website is a little clunky, Robert. I'm not going to lie. The best way to get in touch with me is to just send me an email, robert.gillespie@illinois.gov. Just shoot me an email, because sometimes folks after a program such as this are like, well, shoot, I should ask Bob that question. And please do send me an email or call me on the office phone. We talk to folks all the time about grassland wildlife, and it's my pleasure to visit about these animals, because I know I wasn't there in person, and I'm much more excitable in person than I am over Zoom. But these animals are awesome, and they're my pride and joy. So I'm happy to talk about them.
Great. Any other questions? All right. I think that is all we have. So thank you very much for joining us again.
Absolutely. It's my great pleasure. I look forward to coming up to visit with you guys all in person. And we can talk about other things besides prairie chickens too. Because there's a lot of different topics about grassland wildlife, and it's my great pleasure to visit about them. You guys have been great. I've had a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bob. And thank you everybody else for joining on Zoom and here in person. Mike, do you have anything else to add?
Nope. What? Go look for birds.